So there's reason to think that the Gurdjieff was actually born in 66, which made him 83 when he died in 49. Another thing that's disputed is how his name is to be pronounced. English people, particularly people with a plum in their mouth, tend to talk about Mr. Gurdjieff. And other people, sometimes one hears variations like Gurdjieff and Gurdjieff. So I asked his niece, who was the daughter of his brother Dimitri, because his maiden name was the same. And in the Slavonic tongues, the G, of course, is not pronounced at all, almost like a Y. So the correct pronunciation is something like Gurdjieff. But we'll call him Gurdjieff, if only because in his groups he's often referred to as Mr. G or simply G. When he was still a small child, his father, who was a wealthy sheep owner, owned many flocks, lost them all through disease and was impoverished and had to move. And he moved to Kars, a small town in eastern Turkey, then recently overrun by the Russians. It's very reminiscent of what's going on in the Balkans today, isn't it? And so young George grew up there with a father who was a poor man, a carpenter, an epic bard. He used to recount stories from going back to Sumerian times. It's very interesting that when the tapes relating to the story of Gilgamesh were discovered, she found that the story on tapes was precisely the same as the one that had been handed down from generation to generation by word of mouth. Young George was fortunate in the circumstances in that he attracted the attention of the dean of the Russian Orthodox Cathedral, which was then part of the military garrison at Kars, and he was taken into the choir. While he was in the choir, of course, he was educated by a succession of deacons, that is, educated young men, who were going to become priests and who were waiting for appointment to their parishes. And while they were there, of course, they were gainfully employed in educating the choir boys and so on. So, young George grew up multilingual, Armenian, Greek, Russian and Turkish, and he acquired other languages later on. The burning question, which was with him for the first half of his life, until he solved some of it, or part of it, what was the purpose and significance of life on earth? What's it all about? What are we here for? Where are we going? What are we doing? We hear about God. Who is God? What is God? What does it all mean? And determined to find an answer to these questions, he set out when he was still in his late teens, I think, on a series of expeditions to sound out many traditions, many esoteric teachings, the Buddhists and the Lamists of the Far East, the Sufis of Central Asia, who were then grouped around Bukhara, now part of the Soviet Union, the Hindus with the Vedic tradition in going right back to the Ice Age and the time of the solar sun, the solar inhabitation, the Christians of Ethiopia, the Copts of Egypt, and of course, naturally, the monks of Mount Athos, and particularly, perhaps, the Zoroastrian tradition. Zoroastrians today are found only amongst the Parsis of India, but there is also an esoteric Zoroastrian tradition called Zervanism. A large part of Gurdjieff's teaching ultimately. He, in the course of his studies and his travels, and he studied with many groups, Sufis, yogis, Zen, and so on, he acquired remarkable powers, not only the powers of one normally associates with clairvoyance, telepathy, and hypnotism, but what one might call the power of concentrating his vital forces. And I quote now from something he wrote himself. In my past life, being merciless to my weaknesses, note that, and always keeping watch on myself, note that, I could attain almost anything within the limits of man's possibilities. By only a few hours of self-preparation, I could, from a distance of tens of miles, kill a yak or put an elephant to sleep. Now before he, which he did some around about the age of 40, I think, he renounced the use of these powers except for the sole purpose of healing. More important, I think, for these powers, which are not the aim of the search, they can even be a hindrance. More important, I think, was that he found answers to many of his questions. Especially, we are told, especially useful to him, it was when he was taken into a society of sages in Afghanistan, in Central Asia, called the Salman Society, which was said to have existed since Babylonian times, and which contained monks of all the real religious traditions. And the first thing that he explained in his cosmology, as distinct from his psychology, there are two sides to the teaching, of course, the cosmological side of the psychological side. In fact, in the end, they come together and there isn't any difference between them. But it takes a long time to realize this. In explaining the reason why so many terrible things happen on earth, the reason why God doesn't seem to intervene, it is, of course, impossible for us, fallible human beings, with our limited minds, to put it adequately into words directly. And the truth has to be conveyed in an allegory or a myth. And Gurdjieff said it's something like this. To begin with, God, that is the Absolute, he preferred to call him the Absolute, or sometimes his endlessness, resided on his own Son, the Son Absolute, surrounded by his angels and archangels. And everything in that world proceeded perfectly. Everything went according to plan. There was nothing wrong, or unexpected, or cruel, or evil. And then one day, the Absolute observed that the Son Absolute was shrinking, was diminishing in size. Now by that we must understand that if everything goes perfectly as it should according to plan, in a sense nothing happens, because the end is already in the beginning. And if any of you are physicists, you'll know that this is the state of matter at, I think, the electronic level. There's no distinction between going forward and going backwards and so on. And so, because everything went out perfectly, in a sense, not only was nothing happening, but what was happening, as each event took place, the possibilities were being reduced. And in the end, there were fewer and fewer new events possible, because there was nothing renewed. There was nothing renewing the state of affairs from outside. So the Absolute This is, as I say, is an allegory. The Absolute decided that something must be done, and he projected his will, ordered his will, so that the emanations, the vibrations from his sun, would interact with the surrounding ether, the surrounding base material, and create what the scientists today call the Big Bang. In other words, a chain reaction was started, was set off, and all worlds were created, the universe was created, the material universe, the galaxies, and within the galaxies the suns, and around the suns the planets, and around the planets, some of them moons. So there was a great involutionary pouring out, that is, a great pouring down from the source, an outflow of energy which was all the time getting coarser and coarser and denser and denser. And in this way, more and more uncertainties were created, and there were more and more possibilities for unexpected events, new events, which in a sense couldn't be thought of because they were all wrong in a way, if you follow me, happening. And in this way, of course, there was no danger of any shrinkage. Quite the reverse. Most scientists now are agreed that the universe is continually expanding. And because it's expanding, of course, it's throwing up more and more feedback to the source. And so the possibilities for happenings now, particularly at some distance from the source, are no longer determined or ordered by the Absolute, but happened almost accidentally, or at any rate as the result of cause and effect. Now, the further from the source, the grosser and heavier the material. And the Earth, she said, is a very bad place. You can't think of anywhere worse than the Earth to live, except possibly the Moon. It's such a long way from the source. And so man is in a very difficult situation. If we see these things, we see these massacres and these famines, these mass cruelties and so on happening, and God doesn't intervene. And the whole point, of course, of this explanation is that he can't intervene. If he intervened, he would interfere with the whole scheme which was devised in order to keep the show going. So that events on a big scale can't be interfered with, but divine intervention on an individual level is possible, directly or indirectly. We have, as it were, to be slotted in. It has been said that the matter comprising this planet is a bit like one of those Dutch cheeses. It's solid, but there are a few air holes in it, and those air holes represent the possibility for grace, if you like, for a direct divine action to enter, but it's very limited. Now, we know, again, from science, what the scientists call thermodynamics, that there's a constant transformation of energy going on, either anabolic or catabolic, up or down. We know, for instance, that man breathes out carbon dioxide, the trees, the vegetation breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, and man in his turn breathes out oxygen. And if the balance gets disturbed, unfortunately it is now, we're in trouble. There's too much carbon dioxide now being produced, not enough oxygen. So there's a suggestion now that the planet's beginning to heat up. So G's teaching went on beyond this sort of material transformation of energies and explained that there were psychic energies, psychological invisible energies, which were also being transformed. In fact, one of the, and only one of the responsibilities of man on earth was to act as a transformer of energy. Unfortunately, not only is the earth a long way from the source, but there's the question of the moon. Now the moon, according to his teaching, is a planet in embryo. That's to say, it will one day be something like the earth. In the meantime, the earth has to send it enough energy so that it can develop, and gradually over the millennia, millions of years, develop its own atmosphere, and so on and so on. And this energy it's like a hypnotic withdrawal of energy from the earth. If you like, you can imagine the swinging a weight round at the end of a long string. You've got all the time to expend energy to keep this weight going round and round. Some of you will know about astrology, the role of the moon in astrology. It's described as the planet of response, isn't it? Well, I would say reaction would probably be a more accurate word, because as we are, not most of the time at any rate, we don't respond consciously, we simply react to events, to a situation. And G said that the moon exercised a baleful influence on mankind, so that man is in a semi-hypnotic sleep. There are other reasons for this semi-hypnotic sleep. In his massive cosmology, he mentioned mistakes which were made by the angelic, the archangels, if you like. You know, in the Christian tradition it talks about the angel Gabriel and Michael doing this, that and the other. But there's something similar in G, and he says that mistakes were made, man's development was held back, so that now he's not really quite up to the mark. Man collectively, I think, yeah. Nevertheless, there is the possibility of evolution for men, in addition to the physical ray of creation, this physical outpouring. There's an invisible one, and there's a possibility of climbing back. Obviously, we can't go directly to the sun, but we can ascend invisibly to the level of the sun. And in religion, it's sometimes called climbing Jacob's ladder, isn't it? And the religious artists of the Middle Ages used to do a lot of paintings with showing angels climbing up Jacob's ladder and the sinners falling off and going down into the depths and so on. You see, all these ideas are to be found in many different traditions, but not in quite the same form. Now, if one succeeds in doing this, it's sometimes called the octavation, because like a musical octave, there are eight points from the do to the do, from the absolute unmanifest down to nothingness beyond the moon. There are 8 stages, and as one climbs up each rung of the ladder, Jacob's ladder, one is subject to fewer and fewer restraints, fewer and fewer laws. And an example which is often given in teaching groups is that of the citizen who is subject to the laws of the country in which he lives, which may be easier or harder, but whatever they are, he's subject to them. Then he's either conscripted or volunteers for the army, and he goes into the army, and in addition to all the civilian laws, he's subject to the military laws. And then if he misbehaves himself, he's sent to a military prison, to the glass house, and he's subject to still more laws. He's in a very unfortunate situation. Now, the only possibility for that man is to serve out his time in the glass house, go back into the normal life in the army, and then eventually, when he gets his discharge, he'll be back in civilian life, and at each stage, he'll be a little bit freer, won't he? He'll be a little bit of a greater degree of freedom, relative freedom. Well, in climbing, many men can climb a rung or two in this evolutionary ladder, and few men can even go all the way and get to the top and return to the source and, as they put it in the East, escape from the cycle of rebirth, escape from existence, the Sufis say. That then is the basis, sort of the theoretical basis to the teaching which G presented. He emerged from obscurity to teach, as I say, as far as, to my belief, when he was about 40. First in Russia, and then when the revolution came along, the Russian Revolution of 1917, when he'd have been getting on well into middle life, he went briefly to Turkey and then settled in France. From France he made one or two excursions to the United States. And the theme he presented was to bring the spirituality of the East and wisdom of the East to the practical knowledge and capacity for effort of the West. And the means he described as conscious labour and intentional suffering. Now, conscious labour, which is the earlier part of the, if one is enrolled in a fourth way group, which I'll explain the term in a minute. It comes before the intentional suffering, but it means, in addition to all the things one does to try and wake up, all the things one does to be less asleep, it means doing something without thought of reward, maybe only for the benefit of the future. Quite a lot of things are done for the benefit of the future. You know, there are many examples of very famous men who were never recognized until after they died, and then the value of their work began to be appreciated then. And he said, he taught that man's obligation to act as a transformer of energies, whether he likes it or not. He can do it willingly or he can do it willy-nilly, be forced to do it. If he does it willingly, then he gets something for himself, and if he does it because he's forced to do it, then he really does not rise above the animal level. The animals do transform energies, of course. There was a toast which he used to propose. There was a lot of feasting, formal dining, and so on. Here's to a toast to all the candidates for an honourable death, not for those who are destined to die like dogs. The ones who are destined to die like dogs, of course, are all the men who haven't lifted themselves or sought to lift themselves up above the animal level. He started off by explaining to would-be pupils that there were three well-known ways of helping men to climb this ladder, to evolve. The first way, which is the way of working on the body, he called the way of the fakir. You all know about these holy men in the West who stand about all day all the time with their arm up in the air or lying on nails or whatever. The aim there is to, in that way, to develop an immortal will There are also Westerners who follow the first way. They may not know that they may not think of it in terms of a way. But when you think of all these explorers who push themselves beyond endurance and even die in the attempt, people like Maori, who died, one of the first people to try to get to the top of Everest, people like Captain Scott, who pushed himself onto the pole until he and all his companions died. These people, whether they know it or not, they're really seeking to create something immortal in themselves, and they probably do. And the second way, which is the way of these feelings, the way of the emotions, the way of the heart, of course, is he called the way of the monk. The monk does what he does because he feels it will be pleasing to God, because he wants to reach God, to be accepted, and this can be an effective way too. If you know anything about esoteric religion, you know that in a contemplative order, the monks are not engaged in what is known in New Age circles of meditation. That's not what they do. What they are concerned with, above everything else, is to become continually aware of the presence of God. Whatever they're doing, whatever they're thinking. Well, the third way then, which is the way of the mind, the way of the intellect, he called the way of the yogi. Probably the best example today that we know about is Zen, where the pupils are given conundrums, intellectual conundrums, insoluble intellectual conundrums, aren't they? And various other exercises. And this too can be an effective way. The difficulty with these three ways, he said, is that when a man has achieved immortal will, there are always two aspects of himself, what he called two centres, that are not developed to the same extent, so they have to be brought up to the same level. So he called his way the fourth way, which is the way of seeking balance, the way of working on the body, the mind, and the feelings at the same time. And it also differs from the other three ways, because the other three ways all require withdrawal from life, at any rate for a period of years. The fourth way not only does not require any withdrawal for life, but it has to be carried out in ordinary life. And in that way, it can be a much more effective and much stronger way. And the reason is this. If someone gets something from in a special circumstances, now take a monk for instance. I mentioned this becoming aware continually of the presence of God after a few years in the monastery, and then for some reason he leaves the monastery and goes back into the outside world. There's a danger that he'll lose what he's got. But if he's got something similar in the fourth way, in the conditions of ordinary life, then there's nothing that can take this away from him. So he said in that way, he said also it's a quicker way because you're working on all the three centres at the same time. It is, of course, at the same time, in a sense, an easier way because no great sacrifice, no great renunciation is required to start with. Not only are people not required to change the circumstances of their lives, but the circumstances in which they find themselves are probably the most appropriate for them. Now, in connection with conscious labour, this brings us to this most important central theme of the fourth way teaching, self-remembering. Something which many people find very difficult to apprehend. But I suggest that one way of approaching self-remembering is through attention, through the study of attention. If we think about it, we know that there are three levels of attention in ourselves. We may not have any attention at all. We may just be drifting along, the mind vacant or full of thoughts about something else other than what we're doing, and we call that zero attention. And then our interest may be gripped by something. And if it's very interesting indeed, we get so fascinated by it, we almost become whatever it is we're giving attention to. If it's a film, a novel, an interesting member of the other sex, or whatever it is, our attention is caught, held. And then there's what one would call directed attention. Sometimes there's something we have to give attention to which doesn't draw us, doesn't attract us, it's not all that interesting. So we have to direct our attention onto it and hold the attention, concentrate on it. But people who are successful in life usually have a fair degree of control of directed attention. At each of these levels of attention works with a different energy, different psychic energy, or rather, it'd be more accurate to say, different blend of psychic energies. But beyond those three levels, there's something else, isn't there? In which we begin to approach self-remembering, and that is the level of divided attention. You see, normally we are aware of whatever we're giving attention to, or we're aware of our own reactions, our own responses at the time. Very seldom are we aware of both simultaneously. So if we can say, in divided attention, it is I who see you, and at the same time it is I who see you see myself. So I see you and I see myself seeing you simultaneously. That is divided attention, which is the first level of the beginning of self-remembering. Now this produces a different energy altogether. It releases energy, and this energy, which is a very fine energy, immediately divides into three. Part of it, 1/3 of it, has to be used up immediately in the enhanced experiencing of the moment. You've woken up, you're more aware, you see more, you feel more, you are more. So part of the energy is used up for that. Another third of the energy is released for us to fulfill our cosmic obligation and used by the higher powers. And the third is retained in us for our benefit. And this very fine energy that's retained in us can eventually blend to form a finer body, a second body, what Gurdjieff called body Gurdjieff, two-person words meaning the vessel of the soul, or the body of the soul, not the soul, the body of the soul. Now this finer body is similar to what is called the astral body in many teachings, isn't it? The only difference is that in the teachings which talk about the astral body, it's assumed everybody has one. But in G's system, only few people, relatively, not few absolutely, but relatively few people have a body Gurdjieff. If this body Gurdjieff is fully grown, then it can begin to take over certain aspects of a man's functioning from the physical body. And if a man has developed the body Gurdjieff, he knows he has it. There are certain indications, certain signs which will tell him that he has developed this finer body. When he's done that, and only when he's done that, is it possible to begin the search, the climb towards immortality, if you like, towards escaping altogether from existence. The astral body, or the body Gurdjieff as we prefer to call it, is mortal in a way, but it's not mortal like the physical body is mortal. Therefore, first of all, it has no fear of death, the physical body's death. Secondly, there's something there which can go on working, go on developing after the physical body has died. I won't go any more into what happens after death, although G has quite a bit to say about this in his very difficult book, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, All and Everything. Very difficult book. Without a key to it, impossible, I think, to understand. He founded then a school which he called the Fourth Way, and there are Fourth Way groups. There have always been Fourth Way groups. The Fourth Way group, which is a collection of people, may or may not contain a school or two schools, because there are two levels of school. The schools, of course, are invisible. It's like G said, in his wanderings, he said, you'll go into a town in the Near East or Central Asia, and there'll be a dozen mosques there. One of those mosques is an esoteric school, and the other 11 mosques are just the ordinary run-of-the-mill parish places, for the people to go. And how do you know? How can you tell? You can't tell. There's no way of knowing, unless someone takes you there, someone introduces you. And in the same way, there's no way of knowing. Someone tells you that there's a Fourth Way group. You've no way of knowing whether it contains a school or not, to begin with. You might say, well, how is it possible that there are Fourth Way groups which don't have school in them? But very simply, what happens is that there's been a real teacher, and the teacher dies, and those who are able to go on, those who've got enough to go on, go on. But there are always a few number of people, there are always a small number of people who attach great importance to the way things have been done, and who go on repeating, imitating what has been done by the real teacher. And in that way, you get the Fourth Way group, which is not a school. I mentioned that two levels of school. First of all, the first aim is to bring people into a state of balance. That is where the mind or the feelings or the body don't have complete control, where there's a balance between the different aspects of man's being. And in order to do that, of course, there are many skills are taught. I think in the course of my time, I've learned perhaps 24 different skills, from things like bricklaying, carpentry, glass etching, rug making, cooking, Scrubbing the floor, that's an important one. Painting the lavatory is another important one. Play acting, charades, so on and so on, an enormous number of and appreciation of music. You can't teach everyone to play a musical instrument. You can teach them to appreciate music, likewise art. All these things are taught in a big school. I was in a big school, 200, a big group. 200 people in the group. I won't say how many were in the school. And of course they had facilities for all these things. In fact, 30 years ago it was here, not 20 miles from here. Now there's no trace of it. It's always like that. It's gone. There were a number of people who lived in Brighton in those days who belonged to it. In addition, of course, for beginners, certain general exercises, certain techniques are explained, certain exercises are set, certain tasks are set. There's usually a task from each gathering to another gathering. I don't know whether any of you know about the way the Sufi masters teach, but there are in many similarities. Gurdjieff was very much influenced by certain Sufic orders, not by others, because the Sufic orders vary very much. Not by the religious, not by the what you might call the exoteric religious Sufi orders, but by orders like the Qadari and the Naqshbandi, and to some extent I think the Madhhabi. And of course they operate by a combination of group work, sitting round a sheikh, and his barakah, which we call in fourth way Hamlet Zoin, which is an invisible emanation. It's really linked with telepathy. Helps the students invisibly, and at the same time, of course, certain matters are explained, themes are explained. To give an extra. And then at a later stage, there will be specific individual tasks given. A very important part of work is to acquire self-knowledge. You see, we all start off thinking that what is in fact our weaknesses, our strengths. We think of our weaknesses as strengths, and we may even think of one or two strengths as weaknesses, and all of this has to be sorted out. There are 9 basic types in personality, 27 subtypes, and according to the man's type, so it has to be treated. Or you can simplify it still further. Something that's not taught in I explain about types, for instance. Something that's not taught in fourth-way schools, but which explains perhaps better the idea of types, are the 3 Buddhist types of the yes man, the no man, and the undecided man. You all know, the no man's walking along the street and he comes to a shop window full of goods and he immediately points out the high prices, what's wrong with the burger's sale. The yes man comes along, oh, I'd like a handful of that. And the undecided man comes along and he doesn't know what to think, and he usually finishes up doing what everybody else is doing. So there's 3 types for you. Now those are not the types that are taught in fourth-way schools, but it gives you an idea of what we mean by type. Actually, in the tradition to which I belong, great importance was placed on greed and fear and lying, which means lying to oneself as well as to lying to other people. And of course the 2 ways of judging, if you think about it, the 2 ways in which people in life come down, successful people, are either through money or sex. And if those 2 things are balanced with the rest of the being, because then one has already achieved something. Now, yes, in the course of the sort of work in the group, the question of suffering will come up, which really brings me to the second aspect of this teaching: conscious labour and intentional suffering. What is meant by intentional suffering? Well, first of all, of course, there'll be a struggle on the part of a pupil. So part of him will want to do what the seniors, his teacher, tells him to do. And incidentally, when we talk about a teacher in the fourth way groups, it's not necessary always to have a very advanced, developed teacher. Whoever is the senior, whoever knows more, can help you. If you want to climb a mountain, and you're right at the bottom, you don't need someone who knows the last stage of the journey to take you through the foothills. There are plenty of other guides who will take you through the foothills to the base camp, and then you perhaps can get hold of a more experienced guide. So it's something like that. So there will be a lot of help given. In any case, you look for help. You try to help each other. It's not dependent on the charisma as a rule of one individual. Well, then that's a question of suffering. This struggle gives rise to a certain kind of suffering. And according to the teaching, there are four kinds of suffering. First of all, there's the involuntary suffering, which we all experience at some time. What's the things that strike us: bereavement,